How's the week in science?
How's the week in science? Well, it's certainly interesting when you see things like the University of Chicago wanting to have a whole department on race diaspora, and I forget the other part of the title of the department, but they want to make a whole department there, which is not necessarily a bad thing to have race as a form of scholarship, but they want to do it entirely from a postmodernist perspective and critical theory and what have you. So that's a whole mess. And so I think it was Dorian Abbott who finally, because he's there at University of Chicago, finally said, nope, nope, nope. I don't think this is a good idea, and stand up and gave a big speech on that. And he's been an interesting case to watch. He sort of exemplifies what I'm worried about with science, because he was canceled by MIT back in the fall, and not for anything with the quality of his work, which is what I mean. You're supposed to be evaluating.
And by canceled, literally, he was disinvited from speaking.
Yes, yes. So he was invited to give MIT's Earth, Atmosphere, and Planetary Sciences, their department, their prestigious Carlson Lecture, which he had been invited in 2020, but then COVID. And so he was invited in 2021. And then it got around, of course, that he is not a fan of the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. And a cancellation campaign was started. And within a week, I believe, the MIT department said, no, we're sorry, we can't do this. You're because of these views. Well, they didn't say because of these views, to be fair to them, but that was the subtext, because that was what the mob of people who canceled him were complaining about. But it caused quite an uproar, because as I understand, with the MIT faculty, MIT priding itself on being open to many viewpoints in science and wanting to get into some rigorous scientific discussions, the faculty were furious at the department leadership. So it's prompted a lot of interesting conversations, as I understand it, where they're now trying to figure out free speech and academic freedom and the balance with some of the DEI initiatives, although I'm not sure with the way DEI is being done if you can actually have that kind of balance. It's a little bit interesting that way. You wonder. But yeah, they've continued on with that, and Princeton stepped up actually and gave him the platform, so he was able to present on the time he was originally scheduled to present. But it was Princeton University, and it was the Madison program. It wasn't even a science program, because Dorian's in my field. He's a climate scientist, so yeah, he's a physical climate scientist, and it's just I attended his lecture. Actually, it was really fascinating. He was talking about how we can figure out if other planets could possibly sustain life if you based upon XYZ factors of the climate and where they are in relation to their respective suns in their own solar systems and what have you. So fascinating talk. Nothing he should have been canceled over. But Dorian's case is really an example of what I and a lot of STEM professionals are really concerned about when it comes to the imposition of things like critical theory into science and into STEM disciplines. Because it's like with science and those normative principles, you have those four normative principles of science. Like you have communality, which sometimes gets referred to as communism, which I'm not, for obvious reasons. I'm not a fan of communism as a government, so I refer to it by its other name, communality, which is simply to state that scientific knowledge, anything generated by scientific research, belongs to everybody. It doesn't belong to any one specific group. The principle of universalism, saying that you should judge everything equally on their merits without giving regard to race, sex, gender, and all the rest. You shouldn't be giving regard to those things. You should be judging work on its merits. Simplified extremely, it's essentially that the anybody can be a scientist kind of thing. There's the principle of disinterestedness, which is to say you do what you do in science and scientific research for the pursuit of the truth, not for your own self-interest. So it's like, if you have I know we all have those kinds of things, right? And then the organized skepticism principle, which is to say everything goes through rigorous review and testing, and you critiques and debates and what have you before it's accepted into the broader scientific knowledge of a field. But
The organized what principle?
it's called organized skepticism.
Skepticism. Okay.
Yeah. They were first really put to name. They really first had a name put to them by Robert Merton in 1942, and so those are the four main ones. But there's also been other ones that have been suggested since then, and they also have their sort of opposites kind of things. So like the opposite of communality would be operating in absolute secrecy. You don't share anything in the world with anyone in your things. And sometimes that happens just because of nature of like national security related issues that come with scientific research. This happens actually in Africa with weather data. It's really surprising. Colleagues of mine work in Africa on weather data, and they have a hard time getting hold of the weather station data because many African countries actually view that data as matters of national security. So it's very hard to get a hold of that information to do any analysis. And then there's only so much you can publish in a peer-reviewed journal after that because of the different governments from which you are getting data. So, but when I come back to, it's been my perpetual concern is that a lot of critical theory, critical race theory, and all that kind of stuff acts in absolute opposite to all of those things that have been dealt with and that have been part of scientific practice for so long, that it's really hard to not be concerned, as my case, for what's going to happen when the next generation of scientists approaches it from entirely a postmodernist or critical theory worldview. What is going to happen in science? So when I think about it from the opposite, what's the opposite from critical race theory or critical theory? So critical race theory presumes that only people of color, let's say, have knowledge of what racism is actually because they experience it every day. Well, that's saying they have specialized knowledge. They're the only ones who can know. That's precisely to the opposite of what communality would be. And they're saying that some people have special knowledge that others don't. So you can't teach others this kind of information. Biggest one I see with critical theory is it teaches people actively to judge people differently on the basis of race or sex or gender or what have you. And so that goes completely to the opposite of universalism. Disinterestedness, of course, critical race theory, according to its own books in Critical Race Theory and Introduction, they're an activist ideology. So you're automatically violating disinterestedness in that. And, organized skepticism is more difficult, but the where I think it comes back to is that critical race theory doesn't work well with organized skepticism because you basically aren't allowed to rigorously critique the lived experiences of someone. You're not allowed to rigorously critique certain things. And organized skepticism demands that you are rigorously critiquing. So that's kind of the four things. And I worry that, coming now from K through 12 and getting into college, students in STEM and students just generally are being taught to do all the things that are the opposite of what makes science what it is. And so I do worry in the future, what is the next generation of scientists going to be like? And are we going to be able to produce the same quality of science? In particular, I think it was a poll I saw not a poll, analysis done the other day that I saw where something like the US now ranks like 25th or 26th in science education, something like that. We're way down from where we used to be. So over the many years since the 70s, I think this is a heck of a concern to have. Hopefully not with like planes falling out of the sky and bridges falling down as a result, right? I think that's the far extreme of what could happen.
Oh, you think that that's the extreme? You don't think that that's just basically an inevitability?
Yeah, I don't think that's an inevitability, that's going to absolutely happen. But, and again, I apologize. I did have to tweak the microphone again. I just don't know why it won't.
Yeah, that's freaking technology, man.
Yes.
Well, if the bridges fall and the planes fall, that's one thing. But if we can't even do our Zoom meetings, then we're true and well screwed. And even the DEI folk will start to
oh my gosh,
lean back.
It's just, but I can imagine it happening, that somebody makes a breakthrough, and you can't critique that person, and because they are of XYZ race, or you over critique them now because they are of XYZ race. Um, and it doesn't bode well. And I've heard there be an argument, we've implemented this over here and it's worked out okay. We've been able to separate social interaction from scientific research. And I don't necessarily buy that argument, because it's not like science isn't a part of the societal enterprise and provides a lot to society. So it's not like you can get away from entirely separating the two. We try to, yes, but I don't think you can get away from entirely
And
separating them. You
also,
can't entirely separate them, I should say.
the studies that are done to measure, insofar as that they want to measure the outcomes of what they're doing, which is all about changing outcomes, and then they come up with the outcomes, I don't trust them to be honest with the data if it doesn't work in their favor. And that's what happened at the Evergreen State College. They did a very deep survey of all this data, and they cherry-picked it, and they made the case on a very specific reading of the data, and suppressed everything else. So I know, with vested interest and no moral or ethical value that precludes biases or precludes that intention to get what you want, why would they stop? I mean, what's stopping them from completely decimating the enterprise, or at least gutting the institutions that they take over?
That's very true. I mean, there's nothing really to stop them unless good people stand up and say no more. And I mean, that's why I'm very thrilled with what happened with MIT, that the faculty finally said enough of this nonsense, and that there's folks like Dorian, and Professor Anna Krylov is another one in chemistry that I can think of. She's very fascinating. She wrote an article, oh goodness, last year, called "The Peril of Politicizing Science," and it went all over the place, but it was in the Journal of Physical Chemistry Letters. But she basically talked about her experience getting her degree in the USSR before they collapsed, and what that was like, and that her school, whenever her town, whenever it fell out of favor, the name fell out of favor with the party, the whole name changed, and all the encyclopedias changed, and everything along this line. And she talks about that in the context of what's going on now, because, for example, in some physics departments, they won't refer to it as Newton's three laws. They will refer to it as three physical laws.
The rapists' three laws, right? Because he wrote a rape manual called the Principia Mathematica, correctly? I don't know how to pronounce it.
I believe it's that. I forget the name exactly, but things like that, they're wiping away the person who actually invented these mathematical physical laws, or discovered them, depending on your point of view sometimes. That just because that's a white man, you can't have it be a white man that did these things anymore. So we can't talk about that. But it really destroys the stability of science, because if you think about what we do, we build upon the past with scientific research, either by refuting an old study or an old theory, or by building upon an old study or an old theory. So if you're suddenly rewriting the past because you dislike it from a cultural perspective, or because whomever it was back then had views that you find distasteful, and that's distinctly possible. I mean, Gregor Mendel and Charles Darwin both had views today that we would find utterly distasteful in the cultural sense, but their works have stood the test of time as scientists. And so that's the kind of thing that she writes about, and I share that concern that we're just going to get rid of what we find distasteful because of the influence of critical theory in a personal life. And the personal life may not be what we want it to be, but we shouldn't necessarily get rid of somebody's works because of that. I mean, a prime example of this is there was one, it was Scientific American, that sent shivers down my spine when I read it. And it was a horrific smear job on the part of Scientific American, of all places. So then it's like 150 years of talking about science, but they ended up publishing this smear piece after E.O. Wilson passed away. He was famed evolutionary biologist. He was amazing. But reading between the lines, the author tried to paint him and everybody else as racist because of his beliefs on certain things. And not even because of his beliefs. He actually spoke openly against the racism of that was in the 60s and 70s. But he had problematic views, whatever in the world that means to the woke. But what caught my attention was the author then broadened it out to the larger audience and called for, if you can want to figure this, truth and reconciliation in the scientific record, which was utterly horrifying.
A social discredit score, I guess.
I guess so. To flag anything that was problematic and talking about citational practices to try and remove any problematic material.
And to broaden, include diversity and leaven the resources from a number of different identities, giving them input.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was strange, but things like that, you know, when you're supposed to be judging on the merit of something and stuff like that starts to creep in, that's where I really wonder if there's going to be really meritocratic science or even an attempt at it without some folks like what Dorian has done, what MIT has done, Professor Krylov. And there's another group in Heterodox Academy now that is just all sorts of STEM people who've had enough of this nonsense influencing their field. So I think the nice thing is that the STEM folks are so much more pragmatic about it and recognize the harms of some woke ideologies, woke being the colloquial. It's really what postmodernist critical theory. There's so many different names, but they recognize the harm that it could have with respect to STEM and the teaching of science in to the next generation. And so they don't want it anymore. I think it was about 1,500, myself included, who signed on to an open letter demanding that the California mathematics framework be removed, because the mathematics framework essentially teaches no math. There's no math that's taught in that K through 12 education framework. It's all about equity and critical theory and social justice. And all the example math problems in the framework, it was strange because they talked about there being, they would have teeny tiny bits of math, but then it would devolve into this thing of, well, don't you think this person could, that a boy could do this or that a girl could do this? Or you'd bring in the ideology of social justice right there, but you're not teaching math anymore. So it was about 1,500 STEM people who signed that open letter, myself included, just saying this is going to wreck a student's chance to get into a STEM career in college, into a STEM major and onto a career, because you're not actually teaching them the basics of math that they need.
Well, not necessarily, because the DEI stuff it's already in the colleges. So they'll accept them, and then they won't teach them anything. They'll give them these PhDs. And then after getting the PhD, if the person wants to not fail in the workplace, then they're going to have to go back and actually learn things and pay a bunch of money, maybe, to learn how to do these equations or whatever. Read statistics, let's say. So I think it's really about passing the buck more than anything else.
Yeah, I could see that it is just about passing the buck, but in either way, it doesn't help prepare students for those fields and getting into those particular fields. And it's like, for myself, I'm actually a climate scientist on the back end. So, hey, deal with the climate change thing all the time myself, but there's a tremendous amount of calculus and differential equations and all sorts of things involved in that field. And when you get into the climate models, it's into computer coding and what have you. So not being able to work with all of that and understand the logic that goes into it, because there's a tremendous amount of logic alongside, it's going to be really difficult for those folks who really want us to actually do some kind of adaptation or mitigation with respect to climate change. And now the models don't even work either because you've dropped in a whole bunch of people who don't know how to do the math. And I've recalled I know a colleague of mine has said to me, it's just like they came into basic medical health class, basics 101 class, the statistics for medical health, and none of them could do the mathematics work that they were supposed to be able to do when they came into the class. So professors could just pass them off. At the same time, I kind of wish they wouldn't, to just show the point that there's a heck of a disconnect between the social justice stuff now being taught in K through 12 education, and the other stuff being taught in college, which I don't know where it's going to end up. I don't like where it's going, but
Yeah, you don't know where the breaking point is, but it's pretty easy to have a predictive model of collapse of a number of different institutions. But on another topic related to climate change, there was this tiny little clip taken out of context of a Joe Rogan interview with Dr. Jordan Peterson. And I didn't listen to the whole thing, but there was this, I think Jordan was trying to make an argument that there are so many different variables in the climate that it's really, really difficult to make these predictive models or to assign values to that. So I'm sure that you, being immersed in this, understand how complex it is and what kind of sense we can be making out of this potentially infinitely varied or variant, multivariate, or
oh, it's very multivariate. Yeah, it's
infinivariate, maybe. I mean, it's basically there's no end to it. So, where have you been concentrating, or where has climate science been concentrating to actually make solid predictive models? And what are the most solid methods? And then how does that translate into human behavior? Or do you even worry about human behavior? Is that a variable that you're like, I'm not even going to touch that one because it's a whole other world of pain?
So we do actually worry about human behavior in the sense of larger scale society, mostly. What is global society at large going to do with respect to how much emissions and how often and what types and all these other kinds of factors like that. They form what can be colloquially referred to as just emission scenarios. And to say, we think over time in the next 100 years or so, or even I think they do, the IPCC modeling actually does their climate modeling for whatever reason out to 2300, which makes no sense to me to try and do when we're talking about decision making, but I can understand that they're interested in the chaotic flow of the model.
I have one minor rule on my channel. If a guest drops an initialism or an abbreviation, they have to actually say what those letters mean.
Okay. I appreciate that. I absolutely appreciate that because I know there's a boatload of acronyms.
Yeah, we'll probably have more, I can tell.
Is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Okay.
But
and they try to go out to 2300.
Yeah. So far is what I've seen in the last in the last assessment report, they tried that. It was buried in the details of the report, not in the executive summary, which everybody sees. But they tried that. And so those emission scenarios are the first thing. And that comes to that's a whole modeling exercise in and of itself, where you are trying to estimate different scenarios. And they're really what ifs, in the sense of what if humanity does this? Okay, we're going to give it this amount of CO2 emissions out at 2100. Or the way they have done it previously in the most recent generation of climate models that are available, the way they've done it is to consider, we're not going to give it necessarily an exact amount of emissions going all the way forward. They can, but what they look at is the amount of emissions that would be needed to get to a certain amount of radiative forcing applied to the atmosphere. So how much heating essentially is applied to the atmosphere. Measured in energy, it's 8.5 watts per meter squared was the upper end that they used on the last thing. So adding 8.5 watts per meter squared of energy by the end of the century.
Okay. And most of that energy is coming from the solar radiation being trapped in the atmosphere, not necessarily what's happening in the atmosphere to produce information. Just I'm
essentially,
totally
it would be it would be if you're increasing the amount of fossil fuel emissions and getting more CO2 or methane or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, you would have enough to reach that point of having an additional 8.5 watts per meter squared of energy that is retained by the Earth's surface, and that translates into a certain amount of increase in temperature globally by 2100. That was their high-end sort of doomsday scenario. That was what all the alarmists were going off of at the end of the world kind of thing, was that high-end scenario, which translates into the 3 to 4 degrees Celsius increase in temperature over pre-industrial times. But bear in mind that's in the global average temperature. When they throw around that 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, it's always the global average temperature. It doesn't necessarily translate to exactly what's happening in your part of the world, which is where people do get confused. It's interesting. I remember Senator Inhofe with the snowball on the Senate floor years ago, just like it's snowing outside, what about global warming, kind of thing. And it's an easy thing to. It's a hard thing to wrap your head around that what we're talking about is the global average temperature when it's in a blizzard outside, like in the Northeast right now. So there is that particular challenge.
And then also the differentiation between climate change and then human caused climate change, which is two other big conversations you have to understand. A lot of people, without really understanding or having enough of knowledge, will say the climate by definition changes. Mm-hmm. It just by definition changes. And we've gone up and down over the course of millennia. And so far as we've recorded it, 1 year is never the same as any other year. So to what degree is that? Well, to what degree we're natural is one question, but to what degree the climate change is just a part of a cycle or not is another open question. And I guess that's another variable that you guys contend with.
Yeah, based upon many, at least in the U.S. now, the station record of observations from weather stations all over the country is in places more than 200 years old in just weather station records. On top of that, you can add things like sediment core records from which we can deduce certain things about what was happening in the climate many hundreds of years ago to thousands of years ago. There's ice cores, which also, if you're going into paleoclimate, that's where we start in paleoclimate records, is based in ice cores. We can actually look at the bubbles of air that were trapped from however many thousands of years ago when the snow fell in the Arctic. And with the different machines that they have on that, I'm actually not entirely an expert on that, so I'm going to be generalizing a little bit, but you can look at the composition of the atmosphere as represented in that little bubble of air, and it's based on different isotopes of oxygen and the prevalence of those isotopes in that bubble of air. You can say something about how warm the atmosphere was at that time, however many thousands of years ago. So the long-term paleoclimate record is something like 18,000 plus odd years that we can pull from different observations. I think it's even longer than that, because if I recall correctly, yes, it is much longer than that. Based on some of the paleoclimate records, there's some of them that go back, I think it's 800,000 years is what they have in the long hockey stick graphic, if I remember correctly.
And that they're able to extrapolate from these ice cores global temperature, even though they're just taking it from very local places.
They can extrapolate a lot from just those ice cores, and not just one in one place or something like that. They do it all over the place in Greenland or Arctic, in the Arctic, and some in Antarctica. So seeing them be consistently the same thing, particularly when you're talking about northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere of the record, that's what can give a lot of confidence that, we know that the global temperature was something around this, or X degrees different from what it is now. So that gives a lot of confidence in those. Obviously, it's not perfectly confident because we're relying on what is the composition of a bubble of air, essentially, and what those isotopes were to say something about hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Yeah. And it might have just been a penguin fart, and that's what you're measuring.
Penguin fart captured in a bubble. It's possible. It's possible, I suppose. I don't know that one off the top of my head, but things like that, you can get into the very long-term record. So, but it's at least 200 years of observed record in the United States, and it's many more hundred. It's, I think, at least 300 years or so in Europe, because they had the weather equipment measuring for longer. And the other thing you can go off of is historical written records. Benjamin Franklin was known for this, in that he kept track when there was a hurricane that came by, it was a hurricane that came by, and he watched how the wind knocked down the trees in different directions. And so he picked out that there was this swirl of air that went through and knocked down the trees in this wonderful circular pattern when it passed by. So we also rely on those kinds of old historical records written back at the time. It's like, when somebody says, well, my grandfather remembers that the Albemarle Sound in North Carolina froze over in XYZ year, we might have enough data to go back and look, or we might rely on other written records and say, oh, yeah, it was definitely cold enough. And I mean, Washington crossing the Delaware was another example because that was a freakishly cold year when they actually did that. So I was thinking about it because there was ice in the Delaware River when, when that happened, when they were crossing the river, according to some of the historical records. It's just like, that was a really anomalously cold year. And I feel terrible for Washington's men when they did that, to be honest. Like,
Yeah, well, they didn't have much with regard to infrastructure themselves. They were very much a pickup army, underfed, underclothed. I'm reading a book about climate change by Neil Stephenson, so it's a fiction book, and he has this interesting scenario where a billionaire is trying to talk a bunch of other billionaires into shooting rockets into the sky filled with sulfur to somehow change the composition of the atmosphere. And there's this one section, it's either from the book or another article, and I'm sorry, I'm skimping on the name of the novel, but it's Neil Stephenson's latest book, where one character in the story is talking about this single eruption of a single volcano created such a drastic change in the atmosphere that it actually cooled down the temperature of the world. And if we were running these rockets, there's all this science of these rockets shooting and stuff, we would have to be doing it for so long just to do what happened in one day. Which is an interesting experiment. Maybe we could just blow up Australia and release enough greenhouse gases or something like that to to reverse global warming. I don't know. I know that's beyond policy. That's more like geopolitical war. But
it's so that is a real thing. It's called geoengineering, is what that's referring to, and it's really fascinating. I did a lot more with that in college than I do now, but it's predicated on the idea because aerosols, both from volcanoes and from dust and dirt and debris like that, they have a natural cooling effect. They reflect a lot of sunlight back out to space. So the idea was, okay, let's get a lot of these aerosols and pump them into the atmosphere ourselves, and we can reverse the effect of global warming, and we'll be fine. From an ethics perspective, some of the alarmistic folks would say that's just sweeping the problem under the rug because you're just giving everybody license to keep spewing out fossil fuels and what have you, because you can always pump more aerosols into the atmosphere to cover it up, right? But then there's the other global diplomatic question of who is it that controls the thermostat of Earth?
Yeah. And then when you're messing with a complex system, you don't know how it's going to shake out. So there will be losers and winners, and sculpting or resculpting.
There's a lot of things that we do know, though, because getting back to Jordan Peterson's thing about, admittedly I haven't seen that, so I don't know exactly what Jordan and Joe Rogan said, but getting back to that, and truthfully, we have actually done a decent job of modeling the atmosphere. Not perfect and decent job of modeling the climate, because the first climate models were actually running in the 1960s. And so we've been able to look at, the early 2000s, how well did what we ran 40 years ago on the giant IBM computers and things like that from Hidden Figures and what have you. How well did they do in what they were meant to do, which they were meant to go after what's the change in the global average temperature. They weren't designed to predict a snowstorm in DC 40 years from then. And they actually did a decent job, according to the studies that we found, that they actually got pretty close to what the year 2000 and the early 2000s ended up being in those analyses. So it's not like we can't do it. And I think where people get confused is that a climate model is a tool, and you can only use a tool for what it's designed to do. But when you try to start using it to do things that it's not designed to do, then you're asking for all sorts of problems, because you don't know, does that really work for that? An example is yes, you can do global average temperatures and things like that, but folks are now asking, well, that tornado outbreak in December, was that the result of climate change? That's a very localized phenomena. A climate model can't tell you anything about it. It's not designed to do that. We can make some inferences about it, and what they infer as the reason why that happened is not that that specific event was caused by climate change, because that's the realm of weather over climate, but that the conditions have grown more favorable to make those kinds of events more likely to happen. Let's put it that way. So when we're talking about climate, when talking about climate and extreme events, it's never climate change caused this event, as much as the alarmistic, crazy people would want you to think that. It's more so, did this event become more likely because of the change in climate over time? And so that's what we get into with things like snowstorms or tornado outbreaks, or even Hurricane Harvey was a fair question there of how much of that rainfall would have been had we been in sort of pre-industrial global temperatures. Temperature and extreme rates of rainfall actually do have a really strong relationship. It's been like a warm, humid day where it's been all sorts of moisture. Well, all that moisture has to get rained out somewhere too on top of it. So the warmer the atmosphere, the more the atmosphere can hold in a given area in moisture. And so when it starts raining, it just rains a lot harder. So
okay. So on one level of analysis, acts of God just happen. Crazy crap happens in this world. Disastrous, crazy things happen all the time. And even though the human mind makes it bigger or smaller and can't really see beyond it because it's so terrifying, and now we have all these cell phone footage of all this stuff, so it becomes even bigger. But with that said, you can still make a case, or have you made a case? Do you think it's reasonable that the direction in which the climate is changing is increasing the likelihood of erratic or violent or extreme weather systems? Is that something that we can reasonably say? And there's something that's a little less extreme question, but is it reasonable to assume that we're going to get 2 inches of sea level over the course of the next 100 years, which is a different problem, but it's not the biggest problem in the world. We could just kind of move inland unless we don't have any land left, which I don't know if that's possible.
So to the first point with extremes, it really depends on which one you're talking about in terms of how much confidence we have that this is being made more likely or less likely because of climate change. Tornadoes, that's one of those things where we think this, but it's a lot less confident in it because it's such a localized phenomena. When a tornado outbreak tends to happen, it's usually a small area. It doesn't cover more than 1 or 2 states or parts of 1 or 2 states.
Yeah, and it has to get going, so it has to have a
right. And the time scale of tornadoes most of the time is on the order of minutes, because a tornado on the ground usually lasts less than 5 minutes and it's done. Okay. In that 5 minutes, depending upon where it is, it can cause tremendous amounts of damage and how strong. The outbreak in Kentucky was wildly abnormal in the sense that tornado was on the ground for 2 to 3 hours, which is extremely rare to see.
Wow.
Yeah. It's really, really rare, that one. So there's probably going to be studies to the nth degree on why the heck that was. But for something like heat waves, that has been observably seen to see more heat waves going on in the U.S. and more hot temperatures in the summer. But
I know this might be a stupid question, but what's the technical definition of a heat wave? Like, what do we mean by that?
Mm-hmm. So generally, it's a day of 3 days or more where the high temperature is in the top 95th percentile of all the high temperatures that occur normally. So it's 3 days or more. In other cases, you may also find that they extend that to the low temperature too. So it's a 3 days where the high temperature is really hot and the low temperature is also really hot. So they're both in 95th percentile. And one of the reasons for that latter definition is they've been finding on the health side of those studies that folks can survive really hot daytime temperatures if the low temperature is cool enough that people recover physically from the stress of the high heat. And this is, of course, speaking of people who are outside a lot or who don't have access to air conditioning or things like that. Your body can recover very easily if the low temperature still is cold enough at night. Mm-hmm. So that's a human health aspect to it. So there's been some incorporation of that definition too, including low temperature, but it's generally 3 days or more where the high temperature is very hot in a given area.
It's reasonable to suggest or to conclude that is the byproduct of the change in our climate.
Yeah, that the increase in those. That's fairly confidently been linked to an increase in the global average temperature and climate change more broadly. Or I should say, well, we can get into the human argument versus the not human argument. That's a whole other That's a whole
Just
other
about
discussion.
causality
The
or
cause in recent
response?
history. You mentioned earlier the language thing where some folks it's like sometimes climate just changes naturally and what have you. And that has
Yeah.
probably been my biggest aggravation in terms of the communications aspect because there's not the clarification given that what we mean in this current time is that most of what was happening with the change of climate is human driven, as opposed to what has been in the past naturally driven. The natural oscillations and fluctuations of climate are still there in the background going on even in this current time. What we've added onto it since the Industrial Revolution is the huge amount of human influence. So that's still there in over the many hundreds of years now since the Industrial Revolution. Yes, humans have had quite an impact on the climate. Not the only thing, certainly not the only thing, because natural impact is still there. So, but there's never any distinction given in the language, and it drives me nuts when I have to
Okay.
talk to people about it because it's just like, oh goodness,
Yeah.
which climate change do you mean? The one that's human caused or the one that's happened forever at this point is
Okay. Yeah. So it's important in explaining and just I guess for a random passerby listening to this conversation, just getting all the different ducks in a row and all the questions. Like here's just my only knowledge of this just comes from just absorbing the discussions and pop culture, or on the street and stuff like that.
indeed, yeah. Pop culture is another thing. It's just like I
Oh,
did
we
a
want to
video
talk
on my
about that climate change because there's a lot of climate going on there. There's some heat waves, 2 or 3 days. Have you ever been canceled? It's like a 2 or 3 day heat wave. It just keeps on going and going and going.
I know, but it's no, I did a video on my channel early on my channel and YouTube early on AOC actually, and where the 2030 thing came from, that we have 12 years until the end of the world thing that she started in 2018. I was just like, oh gosh, yeah, I think it was in a news report actually that even the authors of the report that had that number in it were like, no, that's not what we meant. The world is not going to end in 2030. So yeah, that famous clip of her talking about that, I don't think I need to say that for either of our audiences. They've probably all seen it and laughed. But where that was drawn from was a real report. And it was, again, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They do various reports aside from the big assessment reports every year. And they did one which was basically trying to estimate when they think the increase in global average temperature will be 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial global average temperature. The thinking being that the thinking
like
being
keep it
that that at 1.5 degrees Celsius, you start having significant problems with ecosystems in different parts of the world, and there's lots of impacts to societies, and particularly the most vulnerable. At 2 degrees Celsius, things start becoming irreversible, and all this kind of stuff. So the study was, when do we hit that benchmark, or how much time do we have to put in CO2 into the atmosphere before you're guaranteed to hit those benchmarks?
And by irreversible, are you talking about like logarithmically? It's just going to exponentially after this point. It's going to keep on going, or we're going to be in a different
that
world?
changes to the climate will produce irreversible damage to different ecosystems and societies as a whole.
Okay.
So not necessarily a logarithmic, like temperature is going to keep going off the charts. That's not what's meant here, because they still want to. There's still the other scenarios of keeping things below a 3 or 4 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures. But let me see here. The study itself, the report itself, was basically, when do they think that's going to happen? And what AOC keyed in on, 2030, was the earliest year they thought was possible. What they provided was a range of years from 2030 to 2052 where they thought it was possible. And so she basically took the earliest one there to, basically she was thinking of Green New Deal at the time and promoting the whole thing.
Catastrophizing the climate?
Essentially, yeah.
Gain.
She was catastrophizing the report, but even the authors of that report had to come out when they come out and state publicly that's not what the report said. Didn't, of course, get anywhere near as much play as AOC saying the world's going to end in 12 years.
But when we go into that human climate or the human factor, from your point of view, from what you know, what is the biggest impact that I guess we're doing right now? What's the biggest? What's like the industry or the product or whatever it is that has is the bleeding edge? Is it my car out in the back? Is it however I'm getting all the electricity in here? Is it something that China's doing in order to build my computer? Like what part of it connects to me, or what am I consuming, participating in, that has like the biggest percentage of influence on that?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to say, I want to say it is a lot of where we get the energy in the electrical grid. Where does that come from is one of the biggest things that we're concerned about in terms of the amount of emissions. What sources do they come from? More so than transportation. Agriculture, though, is also a big one. Emissions associated with agriculture, not cows necessarily, but
cow fart time.
Not cow farts. No. There's a lot of equipment and processing associated with agricultural production that they also believe drives a lot of emissions. So there's just the energy grid itself, but there's also the different industries which pull that energy off the energy grid. So that's a lot of the ways it's broken down, is looking at which of those industries is it really, more so than just which thing. Is it the electrical grid? Is it your car? Things like that. They look at different industries. So transportation is one industry. Agriculture is certainly one that they consider. Just energy production in general is one part of it. They have their own emissions component there. Actually, one thing you may want to look at, and that's why I'm struggling for it, because people think it's just about switching to renewables, which renewables won't work long term, in my opinion.
Is nuclear a renewable?
Nuclear is technically not counted as a renewable. No.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure the reason why that is, but nuclear is not technically counted as a renewable. But the thing is, it's not just about the renewables. So there's a great book and website called Project Drawdown, which actually, what they do as a project is they go in every so often and they rank order solutions. Their words, I don't think it's necessarily the best choice, but for climate change, global warming, in terms of how much will this reduce emissions, how much will it take out of the atmosphere. And some of the solutions they found have been actually really been surprising, because they'll look at these solutions and they'll rank order them by which one's the best. And if I recall correctly, one of the ones that they found was the best was just changing out your refrigerant system in AC units and fridges and things like that to something that was more environmentally friendly than the chemicals of Freon and what have you that are currently in them. So it's something as simple as that. So
everybody should get a swamp cooler?
Why not?
Is that where we're going? I don't even know if anybody even knows what those are.
Truthfully, I don't know. So you'd have to tell me what a swamp cooler is.
It's a box. You put it in your window. You put water in it, and then there's just this fan. And it just the cool water just pumps in kind of cool.
Yeah, no, it's evaporative cooling. That would work, but not very efficient, but it would work.
No. And then you have little critters in your swamp cooler.
Yeah, that's a great thing to go look at as Project Drawdown, because there's a lot of great unorthodox things. Because I haven't seen them in the media. I haven't seen anybody with the environmentalist groups or the alarmistic folks talking about these solutions. It's all about upending society and changing absolutely everything, to have solar panels on roofs everywhere and things like that, because the problem is, unfortunately, solar is not very efficient. Solar is not very energy dense, let's put it that way. You need a lot of land space to get the same amount of energy that you can get from natural gas or from oil or from a nuclear plant. You need a tremendous amount of land. And long term, that's not a viable solution when you're thinking about, we have all these other things that we want to use that land for, in population growth or in agriculture and food production, or even just to leave natural ecosystems alone and to maintain biodiversity and what have you. But all those competing interests as population grows on top of it for housing and development, having a giant solar farm in the middle of someplace takes away some of that land for those purposes. And the same goes for windmills. They're generally not energy dense either. And the only place to put them, because they're so expensive, is out in the middle of nowhere. So then you have to spend the energy and the money on the lines to get it to the people who need it. I think nuclear is a very good option, at least in the short term. I would love to see some more new energy technology be created, because there's
like what? Like,
well, there's
fission?
been for a few years talk of hydrogen fuel cells, actually. The only problem with them is, of course, you get a nick in it and it explodes. Um,
And not just a little tiny poop.
no,
It's
no,
like-
no, no. You'd be leveling your house, which is a problem.
Yeah.
But they've talked about that with cars for some time, doing hydrogen fuel cells, because you could capture the water, which is the only byproduct, and use it elsewhere. But other things, somebody got creative in Europe, actually, and they made a blast furnace that uses plastic and produces water as a byproduct. So it takes care of a plastic problem at the same time.
Wait. The only byproduct is water out of plastic? You don't get carbon out of plastic? Like, what happens to all
That's
those
my
polymers?
understanding, although that was some time ago when I read that.
Okay.
So I don't know for sure. So don't take my word as gospel
Okay.
on that one. But I would love to see some new energy technologies on that. And I mean, people, it's funny because I'm weird amongst my colleagues in that I'm actually not scared about climate change. It's not the thing that keeps me awake at night that I'm fearing.
It's DEI. Critical theory. Critical theory is your climate change.
It might be,
We have 12 more years before the university system devolves. I'm in that camp too, to be fair.
Well, because I think of, like we just talked about, all these solutions that require scientists and technicians and people who are trained in these things, and yet we're going to screw up all the training with DEI and wokeness at this point. So I'm just like, well, we're gonna end the world as we know it just doing that. No, we won't do that. But I hope we don't go that far.
We have to be responsible. There is climate change. There is ideological shifts on the human level. There are bad ideas, or ideas that increase the temperature or decrease the cohesion, in the very least, of human societies. And if you're not aware of those things and you think that it's all alarmism to call them out, then I don't know how well you can stand and say, well, human beings can change the climate, but they can't change their societies in terrible, no good, nasty
not
ways.
Quickly, anyway. Not as quickly as alarmists would like us to change society. And but no.
What about like geopolitically speaking? If you're I don't know if you're afraid of China or anything like that, or any of these other countries and stuff, but is the U.S. like really the bad person in the room? Are we if you go country by country, even if we change ourselves and other countries don't, like, does that even matter? So thinking about it globally, the human global situation, where do you see change needing to happen, possibly happening, or not happening, and screwing everybody else over?
So it's interesting because, there's the argument of the US is the biggest carbon producer, and then there's the argument of China is the biggest carbon producer. But the truth is, they're looking at the same data, they're just looking at it differently. In reality, when you're looking at per capita emissions of CO2, then yes, the US is the largest number. But when you're looking at total emissions of CO2, that's China, without a doubt, in just the data. And so in the long run, I'm more concerned about, I would be more concerned about how the total amount of CO2 is going to change, not the per capita amount over time. Yeah, sure, we could do more in the US to reduce carbon emissions. That's not the biggest thing that I'm concerned about, though, because we have reduced carbon emissions in the US. You can look at that over time in the last 20 odd years or so, at least in particular. But it's China, for sure, really hasn't done a whole lot to reduce their carbon emissions, from what I can tell in the data. And others may dispute that. Fine. I'm totally fine with that. And the other one is India, actually. India is developing quite well, and you see a decent amount of CO2 production there compared to what it could be. The unfortunate problem is there's a lot of a desire to do what's called leapfrogging, which is to say, let's jump right over CO2, let's jump right over fossil fuels and get all of our developing countries in the world to use renewables right off the bat. Societies evolve right alongside their energy and technology development. So you can't necessarily leapfrog over one societal evolution over another. Folks who were doing wood burning or coal burning now have to move into oil and fossil fuels and what have you before they can get to renewables. They've tried the leapfrogging exercise a few places in Africa and what have you. And Michael Schellenberger writes about this in Apocalypse Never, actually. And it doesn't work. they end up making the countries poorer or less able to adapt or causing all sorts of problems, or in some cases just taking the money and running, really is the thing there. So it's just, you end up not helping anybody you're trying to help in the process of trying to get everybody to go straight to renewables, but that doesn't work. So in a way, I wonder if there would be a way to do an acceleration of societal evolution in some of our developing countries so that they get to the same level that we're at with oil and coal and natural gas, and then they can move right along the trail with the rest of us to whatever the next energy is, be it renewables or nuclear or some combination or some new technology as not heard of yet. But yeah, if I had to say near term, I am not scared of saying it's probably, my concern is China for sure. But that doesn't mean it doesn't mean that there can't be new technologies developed in this country to make things lower too, you know?
Yeah, the thing is, we talk about geoengineering, or you mentioned geoengineering. Now we've mentioned social engineering. Can we screw around with humans on a massive level? Can we screw around with the environment on a massive level? It seems like that always goes awry, or maybe it hasn't. But it always seems to me, and I'm not a historian, so I'm rather ignorant. It's that innovation and kind of free market, whatever that means, kind of like some sort of innovative principle along with your scientific, you put those four scientific things: communality, universalism, disinterestedness, organized skepticism, but actually like taking the knowledge of science, pairing it with self-interest, and then allowing self-interest in some way, set up a system in some way for the system to generate the innovation. I think technology, innovation is always, it's what got us into this mess. It's also what got us out of a lot of other messes.
Right.
So if we put our eggs in that basket, that gets us back to where we started. How do we save our school system? Because we're not going to have innovation, or we're going to fall behind in innovation if we can't get these generations into the innovative mode.
How do we save our school system? I truthfully don't know a good answer to that question, aside from starting some new school systems, to be honest, because there's so many things that are very entrenched. And actually with K through 12 schools, the person I'd recommend there is Deb Philman, who runs the channel The Reason We Learn. But she's been talking about K through 12 education and the problems they're in for some time. And she and I go back and forth in terms of, this is what they're doing in education. This is what I think may happen with respect to science in the long term and scientific practice because of the strange things they're doing in education. And she actually did something on her live on her YouTube the other night on transformative social emotional learning. Now is a whole new brand of that, which yeah, no, I can see where it's coming from there, but it's basically amounted to how do you turn kids to be more focused on the community and the commune, if you will, rather than learning and developing themselves into excellent individuals. You're focused on what is communally the best, which history would show that hasn't worked really well when you're talking about things like the USSR or Mao's China or...
Oh, yeah, but you bring up, if you scale it down to the Amish or Israel, perhaps the kibbutzes, if that's how you pronounce that, which even them, they did some social experiments out there. They tried to go super communist and everybody shares the child and men and women are all equal. And within a generation, they reverted back to normalized gender roles because nature is what nature is.
Nature is hard to mess with.
But like the Amish, there are different communities that can operate communally, but that would have to be about from my point of view, a narrative-based morality or some sort of religious framework, some broadly religious framework. It can be more secular or less secular, but you have to have some sort of story structure that can tie the stupid people to the smart people, the children to the elders, and get everybody to work together. If you can do that, I don't know if we can do it in our society, in a pluralistic society. We can establish, or we have tried to establish, conditions for many of those different groups to interact. Right. And whenever one of those groups try to take over everybody else, we have resisted that up until
recently.
Certain inflection points. I'm sure during the Cold War, the McCarthyism and the the very strong, or even cultural conservatives trying to tell everybody else what to do and what to think, what's right and wrong. We go through this Puritanism. I mean, what happened at MIT? Didn't MIT get established by Puritans back in the day? And now those scientists are back there. Again, it's a Neil Stephenson book where he talks about the building of the MIT. But there are ways of. It's not all or nothing. That's all I'm trying to say.
No. I don't disagree. I don't think it's all or nothing. But I also think that the things that we're worried about are at this point so entrenched in K through 12 because they were trained in education schools that have since had this stuff invested in them in the 1970s and onward that I don't know that you can really get it out of K through 12 public or private schools as they currently are. I don't know that homeschooling is entirely the answer to get everybody on mass homeschooling, although I would be interested in seeing more micro-schooling come up where groups of parents work together in very small communities to teach their kids. And, one of them might be a scientist like myself and can teach science to the kids, or, one of them could be a math professor or something along that line. And there was talk, I think it was in the older days of this country where you'd have not necessarily groups of teachers, but you'd have somebody who did science for a living who was the one who was actually teaching science in a school rather than what we have now where the teacher has to be versed at least somewhat in almost everything, or they're a science teacher in a classroom or the 7-period day or something like that, where you're just teaching a base level rather than learning from somebody who is brilliant and experienced in it. And that's what they do all day, every day, except for teaching. And I wonder if it would be better in that sense that students would actually be learning something if they were learning from somebody who wasn't a teacher. Not to say I don't love teachers. I think teachers are great people and things like that. I just don't know. I wonder if it would be better what we have with scientific education if there was at least some scientists or physicists or mathematicians or what have you invested in K through 12 education and helping to teach those classes rather than relying on teachers who are more invested, it seems now, in social justice than in actually teaching science.
Well, I mean, if the universities weren't so screwed, we could set up some sort of AmeriCorps where, you get your student loans are diminished. And I know they have this specifically for teachers, but your student loans can be diminished for you just bringing your knowledge that you did into a local community. I know they run that to try to get, they target different kind of zones to boost up, that and stuff. But there can be societal incentives, I guess.
I would hope
to facilitate the passing on of knowledge. And then, if you can convince these nerdy scientists who are not necessarily the best people all the time, they get to learn some skills, maybe some human skills. I'm not saying scientists aren't people, but I am saying that children are difficult, and it's a learning process to be able to teach them.
Well, yeah, that is very true. And teaching undergrads, I have taught undergrads before myself, and just like I'm not actually a teacher. I'm a research scientist, so it's like I'm not ever going to have tenure or anything like that. So it ought to be interesting career wise for me going down the road. But
we could start a micro school. I don't know, these online schools, I know there's downsides to it, but there's emerging market for kind of some sort of roving tutor or some sort of tutorial program with specific input from the person. And that's kind of, it's all mitigated through virtual space, but it's still, you can assemble some sort of personal one-on-one interaction, get a little bit of money for that, and provide tools for society. Do you think about that with your YouTube channel and your other products, your content? Is there stuff that's specifically educational geared, and other stuff more commentary geared? Like, what's the spread of content that you create, and where's your intentionality behind that, or how you set up, design it, and then going forward, where you want to be headed?
So, I mean, at the start, I was just trying to figure out what the heck I was doing. So there wasn't really too much intentionality right at the start with exactly what I was focusing on. But in the last year, I've honed it in that there's an educational aspect to it, in that introduced things like the concepts that we've talked about with the normative principles of what science is and what have you. And it speaks to how bad our education system is, that I didn't even know what they were until 5 years after I got my PhD. So which just speaks to how bad that is, education system there. But talking about some of those philosophical things in science, there's some educational videos on that. There's a lot of commentary there about these kinds of things going on in science and what I think of them and what we should do to push back on that, encouraging some of my fellow scientists who do see it and have told me they have seen it, that this is great. Thank you. I know what to do now when I see it show up in my own fields. And then lately, what I've gotten to do is as what I call the Thursday night review, where I just sit down and review a study of interest to me. And part of me, the reason for me doing it on camera is I give folks a sense, not just the scientists who do it all day, every day and what have you, and therefore can critique what I'm critiquing or critique me critiquing. Is that a good way to say it?
Organized skepticism. Let's just call it that.
There we go. But it gives folks who are not versed in reading scientific studies a sense of, what do I look for as a scientist when I'm judging the quality of a study and whether or not its conclusions are valid. In particular, it's just like there was one I did last week, actually, that was on, it was a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it was Intersectional Inequalities in Science was the name of the article, which was all sorts of interesting.
You kind of knew what was going to be in there from those words,
yeah.
I assume. Yeah,
well, it was fascinating because it was that article was a letter perfect example, which is why I chose it, of why one should always look at the methods section of a study and how it was done. Because if the methods are done correctly, then the conclusions can be well justified, perhaps, even if you completely disagree with the conclusions. But when the methods are done poorly, then that's not a very well justified conclusion. And what it was that caught my attention was the study framed in that they were talking about all of science. So think of all of your different disciplines of science that you can think of, be it from social sciences or physical sciences. But the data they actually looked at and did analysis on, for the vast majority of the paper, they had one figure that looked at every discipline that they had, which included the arts for some reason. Every other figure, though, was about two other disciplines, social sciences and health, and that was it. And so they were attempting to make broad conclusions about, look at all these things that these different groups, all these disparities that everybody faces, but they were making that conclusion saying all of science, but their methods were about social sciences and health, and that's all they looked at. Mm-hmm. The additional thing, of course, is you can also start picking out logical fallacies in some of these articles, because in the conclusions and in the early introduction of the article, they went, well, disparity, therefore discrimination, which, following Coleman Hughes, he's put it quite nicely. That's the disparity fallacy, where you assume every disparity is the result of discrimination, but you can't prove that just looking at the data and saying, hey, look, there's a difference we see here. Well, why is the difference there is the question. Mm-hmm. So that was a good study to rip apart. Well, shouldn't say it that way, to review and to talk with folks about. In my head, I'm always ripping studies apart, and it's like when I do peer review, my remarks in the margins might be a little nasty until I go right up the peer review. But but it's like, no, the other one this week was actually on the rise and fall of rationality in language, which was also in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. That was a much better done paper, and actually relates a lot to what we see in the broader culture with wokeness, for the colloquial, and postmodernism, because they basically are able to show that in the frequency of 5,000 or more commonly used English words, or at least mostly commonly used English words, has changed over time. So that words that we associate more with rational thinking and rationality increased from 1850. The frequency of those words increased from 1850 to about 1980. topped out and then started going down again with a rather precipitous decline in 2007, starting in 2007 to 2019 is where they cut off their study data. So they haven't gone into 2020 or 2021 yet. But
well, I mean, I'm sure they covered this, but this is my first counter to that or clarifying question is
Sure.
that if you look at the data from 1850 to 1980, where's your data? It's probably going to be published books. So they're already gate kept, right? Mm-hmm. This is gate kept. So your sample pool is already selected. Mm-hmm. And now with the internet, you have the plebs. Now we get to see how the plebs do things, right? and this is how the plebs aren't rational and they never were rational. That doesn't mean that, they were less rational or more rational before the internet. So I don't know if they touched on that or if the influx of data.
They speculated a lot in the end of the article about why they think that pattern shows. And you actually see the opposite in sort of the intuitive emotion words where they were going down until 1980, until you got to 1980 and started going back up. So there's actually the opposite curve there. So they did speculate a lot on why they thought that was the case, be it the rise of social media or the incoming of the internet. And they thought the 2007 thing might have had to do with the economic crash then and the disillusion with the system that came about during that time. But they remarked, well, we didn't see the same thing in the 1930s with the Great Depression. But then again, you probably didn't in the 1930s because there was no social media in the 1930s to magnify everything. So they speculated a lot, but it was an interesting observable pattern. I, in part, am kind of curious because I think of 1980s and I again think of that's when 1970s is when you had the real rise of postmodernist thought and academia get started. So finally,
which was pseudo-rational to begin with. It was pseudo-rational. So it used a lot of technical terms that were codes for emotional reasonings. I think somebody could argue that.
That's true. I think so too, actually. But I get into that on my channel and those kinds of reviews to help others see this is how you should look through a study and the kinds of questions you should ask. In part because there's a lot of things that get through peer review that perhaps shouldn't at this point. And the only problem with it is that like we've idolized science so much, and it's a phrase I hate. I hate the phrase "believe the science." I hate that phrase passionately because science is not a belief system. But anyway, thank you very much. But we've idolized it so much that when you see it's a peer-reviewed study or it's a study was done or something like that, it has the veneer of authority, and folks can just point to this study and say, well, this study says this, so that's why we're doing it. But that doesn't say anything now because you're not necessarily critiquing the study to say something. Was that study well done? Does it actually have its conclusions be justified? And therefore, are you then justified in using it to push this particular program or that particular program or policy or any number of different things? And that needs to be questioned carefully if you're going to be, particularly with doing policies that may have a whole lot of impact on a whole lot of people. That would be my concerns. Like, don't do something based upon a study that's actually crap because it's going to end badly for everybody.
Unless it's accidentally the good kind of crap and grows a beautiful flower.
Well, that could happen too. But it's just.
Yeah, it's really difficult, especially when during the time of COVID and on life on social media, everybody's got 20 studies to make their 20 different points. And you're like, well, I don't know how my illiteracy is causing this whole thing to look like a complete mess. I don't know who to believe. I know that some people are jerks. That's about all I know. So, and I don't trust the system. That's all I know, but that doesn't mean that, that's a positive value. Distrust is not a positive value. So it's just
yeah, no. And I mean, there's a lot of studies that are well done, and they'll be competing with each other because one study that's well done will say something one way, and the other one that's also well done will say something the other way, and they may be looking at the same data and interpreted it differently. And that's a normal thing to see in any scientific discipline. You'll see people arguing it with each other in different journals. I mean, the journals do have their own comment and reply section where you can have an article, have somebody comment on the article in peer-reviewed fashion right there, and have somebody reply to the comment. And sometimes they go back and forth for a while, and it's humorous to watch. But you also then have the things that are studies, for lack of a better word, and I put that in quotes because it's like one of the ones that when I started doing the Thursday review section, I started with one where it was quite obvious that had it been a serious job in peer review, that article never would have been published, because it was basically about how to get critical race theory embedded in a public school. That was pretty much all the article was saying, and it was counter narrative as strategy, and I forget the rest of the title. But this whole idea of counter narrative, whereby you just keep pressing and pushing on this particular narrative associated with critical race theory. And they talked in the article, and I covered this in the video on it, about strategies to silence anybody who disagrees openly in the article. I'm just like, how the heck did this get through peer review? It was the International Journal of Qualitative Education Studies, which
qualitative, that's the ping right there for me.
But that's an example of what I refer to as study in air quotes, because it's like, that's not really a study. That's an activist guidebook for how to do something.
Yeah, exactly.
And it never should have been published there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so many different journals now are captured. I mean, Scientific American on down, and it's a sad and potentially dangerous moment in the history of science or the history of Western education. But it's a great opportunity for people like you to not just speak out and stand up, but actually show people, teach people, break free from the hallowed halls and bring the information to the public.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I do feel really weird sometimes in that, you're a conservative politically, you're also a climate scientist, you work in academia. How many different contradictions can I have in one person at this point just to be there? And it's just like, I don't feel like one of the academics most of the time. I get on more so with folks who are outside of academia than the ones that I do within academia, with the exception of my close coworkers. A bunch of them are good friends, but it's just a lot of academics don't necessarily like me.
Well, maybe you're resilient. Maybe you don't want to be liked by them. Maybe they don't deserve.
Maybe not. I don't know at this point, but it's certainly interesting, and just like, I guess the thing about academia that bothers me right now is that they have gone so hard in the direction with the DEI stuff in particular of not really wanting to hear from any particular viewpoint. And in the last 2 years, there's been report after report after report that shows very definitively that students and staff and faculty who are more right-leaning are working in a hostile work environment, or just are utterly scared of actually saying what they think. And admittedly, I've been there myself. I've done that, had that sentiment. It's like, if I speak up and say something right now, am I going to lose my job? It's been something I've been afraid of, but I've felt a lot more, I guess, felt a lot better about myself when I've been honest with myself and actually saying, hey, this crap is wrong and here's why. And sometimes it's firmly but politely pushing back on some of these things that I've found success with. And admittedly, in my own office and my own working with my own supervisor and things like that, I've had some demonstrable success in the last few months saying, look, this stuff is wrong. Here's XYZ reason why. Here's the lawsuits you want to avoid happening that are germane to this whole topic. It was like, I don't think this is a good idea. And found that my supervisor and the leadership of our center where I work at my university is actually quite responsive to that. And I'm not going to mention where exactly I work right now, because that's not
well, good. Thank God for common sense is alive and well somewhere.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's never going to be an ending argument over some of these things. It's like one victory for now, at least.
Well, speaking of anonymity, what the heck does your YouTube channel name mean?
ScioSophia, yeah?
ScioSophia. Where did you get that?
So I drew it from the root words for two of my favorite things, science and philosophy. So science is drawn from the Latin scire, which is the verb to know, actually. And scio is the participle of that, and it just literally means know, like I know or you know. Sophia is one of the two Greek words that forms philosophy. So philos is the first word, which means love of in English, roughly. But Sophia can either be translated as knowledge or wisdom. I prefer the latter definition. So if you want to take the full archaic definition of my thing in both Latin and Greek, it would be no wisdom. Mm. So, but that's where it came from. I like the two things. I just didn't want to say science and philosophy. That was going to be a boring.
Yeah, no. This has got some sex appeal to it, at least some Greek appeal to it.
Nice.
You know. And final question. We can wrap up and have a little after interview chat. But what's the wooist belief that you have?
What's the wooist belief?
Well, I mean, you're science and a conservative, I guess, is pretty woo. But is there something that you allow yourself? And I'm sorry if it's embarrassing. You don't have to answer this, but like you like tarot readings. You look at like astrology charts. you like that. It's just something out there. What's the most out there thing that you indulge in that gives you meaning? That gives you human meaning outside of science, or do you not need that?
Well, no, I am also a Roman Catholic, so I do very much enjoy going to church and religious practice. And for a lot of us as Catholics, the belief that the Holy Spirit speaks to you when you're in the quiet is not unheard of. And yeah, you've had some of those weird moments of intuition where like, okay, this happened. Maybe what do I do with this? And you get an inkling all of a sudden, this is what I should do. So in the belief system, that's saying something of the Holy Spirit is telling you a little bit of something that you should do in this situation. So that's, for me, that gives a lot of meaning to my life. And there's been a lot of things that I've overcome from family troubles and illness and the like that have been more so based on my Catholic rather than any sort of scientific understanding. And that's not unheard of because a lot of the great scientists in history were also very religious people at the same time. So I don't know if it's wooey as much.
That was a perfect segue to that topic. I wonder if you'll explore that, do a religion and science thing, or maybe join me or have a discussion with somebody else about the interplay between religion and science and how they can get along. And I know that Catholicism has a lot of puts a lot of stock in science.
It does,
despite,
although that's
Galileo
not always been
stories,
over its history.
Exactly.
There's like the imprisonment of Galileo for how long? Because he said the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. I think I want to say it was Pope John Paul II who finally apologized to Galileo formally on behalf of the Church, or something like that. That was so long ago. I know that was very long after Galileo's death when the Catholic Church finally apologized and said, no, you were actually right.
Mean, when you're talking about immortal souls, like what's a couple of centuries,
Sorry.
Right.
Yeah, it's like the Catholic Church put Galileo under house arrest because he said the Earth revolves around the sun.
He was living in in a villa or something.
I know
it was really cushy. I mean.
But no, actually, I do want to get into that somewhat, not just the religious aspect of Catholicism or Christianity and Islam and what have you, and how that interplays with science, because I actually talked about it early on in my channel. Some of the foundational things of science came from the golden age of Islam, like the concept of empiricism. But the other thing now is there's a very prominent discussion of framing science as a Western way of knowing. And so getting into those concepts of ways of knowing and the idea of what are we going to do when two of those ways of knowing come into conflict with each other, the discussion of that, because is really where science comes into its own, or some kind of logic and philosophical practice of sorting out who's got the truth. Although then again, if you look at postmodernists, they don't necessarily think the truth exists at all, which is a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Well, they got power going for them until they expend it. That's the problem with postmodernist critical social justice, is that it's very motivated. It can infiltrate. It cannot produce anything good, and it can't help but just destroy and destroy and destroy. There's no positive principle in there. And so what do you counter that with? Liberalism, or some sort of pre-liberal framework that then supports liberalism. And I kind of tend to think that you need to have a social religious framework in order for liberalism to actually work, because it needs to be operated by people of a certain character, and you have to foster that character.
Yeah, people need their meaning. People need meaning in their lives, and it's like sometimes secular society really doesn't provide that meaning. Not to say people can't find meaning from that, but
no. There's a lot of different things. I mean, I about once a year I have Brett Weinstein on my channel, because we have the same origin story, and I was kind of poking like, well, where does your meaning come from? Where does your meaning come from? Because he's Mr. Science and stuff, and like I always like asking those questions and getting into that because more often than not we revert to poetry when we get to that level of the discussion, and it's no longer, you can just feel the tenor of the discussion change from the rational mind into the pre-rational mind, and there's a relationship to that which postmodern critical social justice exploits. Yeah. It exploits the pre-rational. Oh yeah. And doesn't put it in a good relation to the rational. So ScioSophia, you're brilliant. I'm glad that I found you. Somebody recommended you on my channel, and I checked you out, and I was like, whoa, somebody's feeding my brain. This feels really good. So your content is really wholesome and educing. It educes me. So I'm glad to be able to chinwag with you on a Saturday afternoon.
I mean, I'm glad this was a great conversation. I'm happy to. I'm thrilled you invited me. It's just like, holy crap, it's Benjamin Boyce.
What do I do? So plug your stuff. So you got a YouTube channel. You got a locals community. Is that how you operate?
So yes, ScioSophia on locals. ScioSophia for the spelling of it if you go look for it. So right now I'm running on a regular schedule, trying to do 3 videos a week in the morning, but also the Thursday evening review. And it's after the Thursday evening review, I go on a live chat on my locals, exclusively with local supporters, talking about the article and anything else that comes up related off of that. We go for about an hour. And then also for supporters, I started adding a bit called Philosophical Friday, just to add some fun little philosophical bits of what I'm thinking about and invite folks to comment on it. And we're going to be adding more. It's a small community right now, but I'm trying to grow it out a bit, because I think having these kinds of conversations and talking about what science is and isn't, and what I'd really love to do is, if there's any of them out there, is just like get a bunch of scientists in the community, get a bunch of regular old folks it's strange to say it that way, but regular old folks in the community, and be able
and then a bunch of weirdos with degrees.
And be able to get everybody together on a Zoom call and let folks ask each other questions about, what do you think of this about science? What do you think of that about science? And actually be able to have some of those fun discussions rather than everybody screaming on the internet.
No, I run. It's not true that everybody screams on the internet. I mean, my channel's here. And we're just conversating.
This is a great channel you've got.
So we're just chilling. But we talk about people who scream, but we still don't scream about them. Hopefully.
But let's see. So it's on locals. It's ScioSophia.locals.com. It's the same spelling as the YouTube, and it's also unfortunately I couldn't get the same spelling on Twitter, so it's like Shio_Sophia on Twitter.
Yeah. And how long are your episodes on YouTube? And do you have any plans on just taking the audio and putting them on a podcast for people who want to listen on the go?
I haven't thought about doing that yet, but I would actually consider, I'd be glad to do that and start podcasting somewhere. Generally, I try to keep the shorter ones in the mornings on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, or when I put those up in the mornings on YouTube. I keep those under half an hour, so they're usually hopefully easily listening to people. I know I've gotten some comments that I run a little long sometimes when I get excited about something, so I try to keep them a little shorter. The Thursday reviews are longer because it's actually sitting down looking at a study, so usually those top out at right about an hour. But other than that, they're try to keep them generally short.
Well, it's great stuff. So thanks again for showing up, and why don't you say goodbye to the audience?
Bye, everybody. I hope you stay curious.
Oh yeah, that's a good. Do you end every episode with that?
Stay curious, my friends.